and welcome to our show, Brookfield Public Advocate. I'm your host, Bruce Senig. Tonight, we have what some might say is a provocative show, and that's okay. The country needs a serious discussion on government programs, so-called entitlement programs, that were just not there when I was growing up, but now are the 800-pound gorillas in the room. Notice I said gorillas, plural. They're more than just one. The idea for tonight's show presented itself a couple of months ago to me while I was reading in the Connecticut Post a letter to the editor. The title of one letter in particular really got my attention, mainly because of the subject is one that I have had discussions with my clientele for almost 20 years in helping them plan for their futures. This leads me to tonight's guest, Red Janke. Red is a writer whose columns appear in newspapers across New England and throughout Connecticut, as well as nationally in such publications as Bloomberg View. He's also been on a prior show with us. He writes about public policy, covering a wide range of issues including education, healthcare, entitlements, foreign policy, banks and the banking crisis, and the continuing crisis in the Eurozone. A Connecticut native who attended Harvard College and Harvard Business School, he leads a management consulting firm, the Townsend Group International in Greenwich, which he founded in 1990 after a 10-year career on Wall Street. Red, thanks for coming and welcome to our show.
Bruce, thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like you to tell our viewers what exactly you mean by the lost generation.
You said provocative. That is an attempt to dramatize the position that our young people are in today, which is a horrible one from almost every perspective. The lost generation phrase was originally used to characterize young British manhood after the First World War, when so many had been killed on the battlefields. We're not literally losing young people as casualties on the battlefields. Yes, in Iraq, yes, in Afghanistan, but I'm talking about their general lot in their financial position going forward and their prospects going forward. And what I mean specifically by that is the unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds in this country today is 16.1%. The largest category of non-mortgage consumer debt is now college loans. Unions are now negotiating with employers two-tier contracts where new hires earn about half what older workers are earning. New hires, of course, are the younger generation. The entitlements that you mentioned at the opening are exploding, and of course are going to be paid by future taxpayers. And those taxpayers are, of course, young people today. I could go on. This is a horrible hand that our younger people have been dealt.
I agree. With the statistics and the way you just presented it, I have a feeling this isn't a situation or an idea that you've just formulated recently, although it may be due to the meltdown, or have you had this for some time?
Well, it's been a serious issue for a long time. It's become a urgent crisis post-crash and post the Great Recession.
What are you doing, or how are you trying to get the word out?
Writing columns and appearing on interview shows such as yours. Thank you very much for having me.
Do you find your message getting much traction?
I think it gets good traction. I've had overall, for this particular column, very favorable commentary, and the last phrase of which, quoting one online commentator for the online posting of the column, no matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, And that's the real issue. This is not a partisan issue. This is a nonpartisan issue. It's affecting everyone's children are in this position. Democrats' children are in this position. Republicans' children are in this position.
Now, I think I might have a rhetorical question here, but we keep hearing the politicians talk about leaving debts to our future generations. So why do they do the same old, same old? Why is there such a complete disconnect, in your opinion?
Well, to be fair, I think that the crash blindsided everyone, politicians included. And the severity of this problem has, choose your multiplier, doubled, tripled, quadrupled since the crash and as a result of the Great Recession. And also, to be fair, Washington in the 1980s did pass a reform and a fix for Social Security. The Social Security retirement age was pushed up from about, I think, 65 to 67 on a progressive basis, right, gradual basis over
Correct.
time, and the Social Security taxes were increased. So Social Security was, its fiscal solvency as a program was assured in the 1980s, and quite frankly, Social Security is not our severe problem.
Do you feel that this, in a way, somewhat pits generation against generation? I can recall, and you mentioned the 80s, my mother, God rest her soul, when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, I would say was a moderate Republican. In the 80s, I believe, when the Democrats, and we mentioned this on an earlier show, I think do articulate their position better than Republicans, generally speaking. The Democrats, I think, just really piled on about the Republicans wanting to take away your Social Security, and they want to do this, they want to throw babies out, you know, the whole 9 yards. And from that point on, my mother became a Democrat because she bought into that. And yet, again, back in the 80s, as you mentioned, you know, they did have a fix which seemed like it would go on for some time. Obviously, with the Great Recession, that's not the situation. But again, I've always felt it kind of pits generation against generation. And as you mentioned, Social Security, while a big problem, is really only a fraction of the problem of Medicare. And all of these seem to be off limits, yet it's the younger generation that's going to end up paying the bills. Do you believe it's almost pitting generation against generation?
Well, there's a lot there. One, yes, on a literal level, it's pitting generation against generation. But on a practical level, you have children. Right. I have children. I am an impending, I'm going to be retiring sometime in the not too distant future, as you are. We're going to be part of the retirement load on our own children. So I don't think it's a classic interest group clashing with interest group issue. I think every one of us has this issue at home.
And in earlier shows that I've done, some with candidates, some not with candidates, I've told viewers, I've given a statistic that I've been talking to my clientele for well over 20 years, that in 1950, there were 16 workers supporting every one retiree on Social Security. Today, there are just over 3 for every one retiree. And in 18 years from now, the projection in 2030 will be that we'll be down to just 2 workers supporting every retiree. And I'm not suggesting that Paul Ryan's proposal is ideal. It's a start, but I don't see Democrats really coming up with anywhere near what most people might consider a suitable plan. Do you have any feeling about either Ryan's plan or why the Democrats just seem to, knock the plan without coming up with much of their own?
Well, let me address a couple of things rather than just your last
Yeah,
question there.
I tend to ask long questions.
Yeah, you've got questions nested inside of questions there. What I'd like to address is the ratio of workers to beneficiaries. Interestingly, when Social Security first came into existence, providing a retirement benefit to 65-year-olds, the average lifespan in this country was 62 years.
Right.
So that gives further emphasis to your original point about the declining ratio of workers to beneficiaries. On the other side of the issue, I think it's important to note that this country is in a much better position than many other nations. In particular, look at China. China has what is referred to as the 4-2-1 problem. As a outgrowth of their one-child policy that's been in place for 2 or more generations. And the way that works is every child in China, young person in China today, is an only child. Of course, he has 2 parents. Those 2 parents are only children. Each of them have 2 parents. What we have today in China is one young worker working to support 4 grandparents and 2 parents. So it's not a question of 2 workers to 1 beneficiary, it's 1 worker to 6 beneficiaries prospectively in China. China's got an enormous retirement problem impending in the not too distant future. And there are other nations that we could look at in detail, and when you look at the demographics, see that they're in a much worse position than the United States. So it's important for us to understand that as we engage on these incredibly difficult issues, that still we're not in the worst position in the world, and there will be a solution. We will get there. Other of the points we'd have to go back and recapitulate. Your final question was what again? I wanted to get to the ratio.
Well, regarding Paul Ryan's proposal, again, I'm not suggesting it's ideal.
Well, again, I think what Paul's doing, if I'm not mistaken, is he's addressing Medicare. And it's important to make a distinction between Social Security and outright pension benefit that Social Security represents and a retirement health benefit. A pension benefit can be mathematically calculated 20 years ahead of time. The problem with Medicare is who knows what tomorrow's doctor's visit is going to cost, and what the procedure that he says you should immediately go to a specialist to have done next week, what's that is going to cost. So it's incalculable in many ways. And of course, everybody has the attitude that if you don't have your health, what do you have? So every individual is willing to spend as much as it takes to stay healthy. Once you offload that as a personal responsibility and set up programs where the government pays for that individual, every individual has the incentive to access public programs to the maximum extent to again assure their health, because what do you have if you're not healthy? So there has to be, and I applaud Paul Ryan for this, the fundamental import of his proposal is to return a essential level of personal responsibility to people for their own health, so that when they have a slight ache when they wake up in the morning, they're not running off to the doctor because in 0.001% of the time it's bone cancer.